All right, let's just get right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a massive, decades-long, and honestly incredibly complex web, the history of political funding and black money in India. I mean, for over 70 years, the question of how political parties actually get their money has been this intense battleground of changing laws, hidden cash, and massive corporate influence. We're going to go straight to the facts, straight to the data, and straight to that monumental 2024 Supreme Court verdict that basically shook the entire system to its core.
Now, to make sense of all this without getting totally lost in the weeds, we've got a quick roadmap for us. First, the history of political donations. Then, what were electoral bonds? After that, institutional warnings, followed by the Supreme Court verdict, and we'll wrap up with donations for favors.
Okay, before we get completely bogged down in the heavy legal stuff, think about this for a second. It's kind of funny, right? When someone donates, say, a ceiling fan to a local temple, they absolutely make sure their name is engraved on it in like 4 different places. But when billionaires and massive corporations donate literally thousands of crores to political parties, suddenly they want to be total ghosts. It really makes you wonder, what are the actual motivations behind corporate political donations?
All right, Section 1, History of Political Donations, Following the Money.
To really get why the 2024 Supreme Court verdict was such an earthquake, we gotta rewind a bit. Ever since India's very first elections, money has basically dictated power. And the rules? They've constantly shifted in this dizzying game of cat and mouse to manage black money. Back in 1969, corporate donations were just outright banned. By 1976, foreign funding was banned to protect national interests. Then, in 1985, the corporate ban is suddenly lifted, but strictly capped based on a company's profits. Fast forward to 2003, and they put limits on anonymous cash donations. It was just this endless cycle, politicians creating rules and then immediately finding ways around them.
So, how did all those limits actually play out in the real world? Well, let's look at that 2003 cash limit. The law clearly stated that parties had to report the donor's details, PAN card, address, all that, for any single cash donation over $20,000. So what did the parties do? They simply exploited a massive loophole. If someone dropped off millions in cash, the party would just sit there and write out hundreds of separate receipts for $19,900 or $19,500. Problem solved, right? The money enters the system, but the donor remains a total ghost.
And that little game of loopholes, it brings us right to a huge moment in 2014. An NGO called the Association for Democratic Reforms, or ADR, filed a public interest litigation. And they discovered something crazy. Subsidiaries of a British company named Vedanta had actually been funding both the ruling party and the opposition, the BJP and the Congress. The Delhi High Court straight up found both major parties guilty of taking illegal foreign funds. But here's the wild part. Instead of facing the music, these two fiercely opposing parties quietly joined hands in Parliament and retroactively amended the foreign funding laws. They essentially just made their illegal funds legal.
Moving on to Section 2. What were electoral bonds? So by 2017, the system is just completely drowning in untraceable cash, and the government proposes a highly controversial new solution. Let's break down exactly how this new mechanism worked. Step 1. A donor goes to a designated State Bank of India, an SBI branch, and completes their KYC. Step 2. During specific 10-day windows, they buy an electoral bond, and there's absolutely no maximum limit. Step 3. They hand this bond over to a registered political party within 15 days. Step 4. The party encashes it straight into their bank account, completely tax-free. Sounds pretty neat and tidy on the surface, doesn't it? But there's a massive catch.
The whole secret to this entire scheme was that these bonds were what you call bearer instruments. Now, what does that actually mean? Basically, they functioned exactly like physical cash. Think of a 500 rupee note. It doesn't have your name printed on it, right? Whoever physically holds that piece of paper owns it. This guaranteed absolute 100% anonymity from the public. It was quite literally like dropping untraceable cash straight into a political party's lap, totally bypassing any sort of public scrutiny.
But here's the thing. To even make this scheme work legally, the government had to fundamentally rewrite the rulebook. Just consider the before and after. Before 2017, corporate donations were strictly capped. A company could only donate up to 7.5% of their average 3-year profit. Fair enough. But after 2017, with these electoral bonds, that cap was completely wiped out. Unlimited donations were suddenly perfectly legal. This meant a company making zero profit or even bleeding money could just pump endless amounts of cash into the political system. I mean, it absolutely opened the floodgates for shell companies.
Which brings us to Section 3, Institutional Warnings.
Now, you're probably sitting there wondering, wait, didn't anyone see the danger in this? Oh, they absolutely did. Just listen to this incredibly stark warning from the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, way back in January 2017. They explicitly stated, these bonds will undermine trust in banknotes and will not achieve transparency. It violates the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The RBI experts knew right out of the gate that this would let black money and foreign funds just flood the market through shell companies, completely untracked.
And the crazy thing is, the RBI wasn't even alone here. The Election Commission was waving massive red flags about unlimited shell company donations. The Law Ministry heavily objected because the scheme excluded smaller parties, basically only favoring the huge players. And then, highly controversially, the government actually bypassed the upper house of parliament entirely by classifying this massive legal overhaul as a money bill. Despite this collective, deafening alarm from the country's top institutions, the scheme was pushed right through.
All right, let's jump to Section 4, the Supreme Court Verdict.
So for years, this anonymous river of money just flowed, until February 2024, when the Supreme Court finally stepped in and struck the entire scheme down on very specific constitutional grounds. They ruled that electoral bonds completely violated Article 19(1)(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution. That's the right to information. The court basically declared that for a democracy to actually function, a citizen's fundamental right to know who is bankrolling their politicians, that completely overrides a corporation's desire to stay comfortably anonymous.
To reach this decision, the court used something called the least restrictive means test. The government argued, hey, we need total anonymity to fight black money. But imagine you're in a crowded room and you spot a snake. You'd grab a stick to deal with it, right? You wouldn't drop a nuclear bomb and blow up the entire building. The court ruled that using absolute, blanket secrecy was basically the nuclear option. There were far less restrictive, totally transparent ways to digitize payments without keeping the voters completely in the dark.
And that takes us to our final part, Section 5, Donations for Favors.
Once that verdict dropped, the actual data on who was buying these bonds was finally released. And remember how this was initially pitched as a great way for ordinary people to donate? Yeah? Well, look at this. 92.3% of all electoral bonds were bought in massive 1 crore rupee denominations. Only a tiny fraction were smaller amounts. The data instantly proved that this wasn't for the common man at all. This was an absolute playground for billionaires and massive conglomerates.
But honestly, the most alarming stuff is the pattern of quid pro quo that emerged from the data. You had huge companies like Future Gaming, Aurobindo Pharma, and DLF, all facing really intense raids by central agencies like the Enforcement Directorate or the CBI. And then, almost immediately following these raids, boom, massive donations are raided via electoral bonds to political parties. And shortly after that, investigations would magically stall or the companies would just be totally cleared. The timeline is frankly striking.
Now, why does this actually matter to you and me? Because this level of secrecy directly impacted public safety. Let's just look at the healthcare sector. During the absolute height of COVID, 7 pharmaceutical companies, including Hetero Labs, who were making the crucial drug remdesivir, completely failed state drug quality checks. We're talking samples that were yellow and they should have been clear, they were issued suspension notices, but right after this they bought massive amounts of electoral bonds and their licenses were subsequently renewed so they could just keep operating. It's terrifying.
Or we can look at the infrastructure sector. Take Mega Engineering. They donated a staggering 100 crores through electoral bonds in April 2023. Literally 1 month later, they secured a massive 14,400 crore government tunnel project. I mean, this is exactly the kind of donations for favors nightmare the Supreme Court was deeply concerned about when they demanded transparency. But if you want one single number that perfectly highlights how broken this unlimited donation loophole was, it's this: 1,300 crores. That is the total amount donated by Future Gaming alone. But wait for the kicker. Their entire stated profit for that period was only 215 crores. How on earth does a company donate more than 6 times its own profit? It's the ultimate proof that wiping out those corporate caps just turned the whole system into a massive vehicle for shell companies.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. If the very foundation of winning elections in the world's largest democracy relies on thousands of crores of secret corporate cash, who do the winners actually serve once they get into power? The voters who elected them or the hidden donors who funded them?
Transparency isn't just some boring legal buzzword. It is literally the heartbeat of a fair system. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep digging, and I'll see you next time.